In June 1998, the small town of Jasper, Texas, became the center of one of the most brutal hate crimes in American history. James Byrd Jr., a 49-year-old father and lifelong resident, was just trying to make it home when he accepted a late-night ride from three white men. He didn't know it would be the last decision he'd ever make. What happened next shocked the nation. Byrd was beaten unconscious, chained to the back of a pickup truck, and dragged for nearly 3 miles along a rural road, until his body was torn apart. The murder was so savage, so senseless, that it reignited a national conversation about racism, justice, and capital punishment. But perhaps the most disturbing part? One of the men responsible, Lawrence Russell Brewer, showed no remorse. A self-proclaimed white supremacist with a long criminal history, Brewer would eventually land on Texas death row, where he ordered a final meal so outrageous it made national headlines, and led to the state ending last meal privileges for good. It would take 13 years, countless legal battles, and one final walk to the death chamber before Brewer faced the consequence of his actions. And when asked for any last words, he simply said, "No." To understand how a racially motivated killing shook America to its core, and how a cold-blooded killer met his fate with one final act of defiance, we have to go back to the beginning. But first, hit subscribe and tap the notification bell, because this is a case that doesn't just haunt a town, it haunts a nation. Lawrence Russell Brewer was born on March 13, 1967, in Sulphur Springs, Texas, a quiet, working-class town where racial tension simmered beneath the surface and opportunity was often limited by the zip code you were born into. He grew up in a relatively stable household, but from a young age, Brewer showed signs of rebellion, defiance, and a growing disdain for authority. By the time he hit his late teens, his life had already veered off course. At just 19 years old, he was convicted of burglary of a habitation and sent to prison in 1986. After serving a short time and being released on parole, he quickly found himself in trouble again. This time for cocaine possession, resulting in a 15-year sentence that would return him to the prison system in 1989. But it was during this second stint behind bars that Brewer underwent a radical and disturbing transformation. In the racialized and violent environment of the Texas prison system, Brewer didn't just join a gang to survive. He aligned himself fully with a violent white supremacist organization that operated within the prison walls, promoting a doctrine of hate, fear, and racial segregation. Immersing himself in neo-Nazi ideology and Ku Klux Klan rhetoric, Brewer quickly became more than just a follower. He adopted the group's beliefs as his own, wore its symbols on his skin, and embraced a mission of white racial dominance with disturbing conviction. During this time he met and bonded with another inmate, John William King, a younger man who also subscribed to extreme racist ideologies. The two became close allies, radicalizing one another and deepening their shared hatred for minorities. Brewer's reputation within the white supremacist prison gang grew quickly. He wasn't just a member. He became a leader, earning the chilling rank of Exalted Cyclops, a title used by local chapters of the Ku Klux Klan to designate individuals with significant influence and authority. This was not a symbolic nickname. This was an official leadership role within an organized white supremacist movement that actively recruited, indoctrinated, and plotted violence behind prison walls. Prison logs and court documents paint a grim picture of Brewer's mindset during this period. His body became a canvas for hate, covered in tattoos that included lightning bolts, swastikas, and slogans championing Aryan supremacy. He studied white power literature, distributed racist propaganda, and repeatedly expressed his belief in the need for racial purification through violence. Guards noted his growing aggression, refusal to participate in rehabilitation programs, and his vocal disdain for people of color. Brewer himself would later admit, without remorse, that his time in prison didn't break him. It refined him into something harder, colder, and far more dangerous. When Brewer was paroled in May of 1997, just 1 year before the murder of James Byrd Jr., he didn't come out of prison seeking redemption or change. He came out with a mission. Fueled by racial hatred, loyal to his gang, and eager to make a violent statement, Brewer re-entered the free world as a fully radicalized white supremacist. A man whose next act wouldn't be theft or drug possession, but a brutal hate crime that would shock the nation and leave a permanent scar on the town of Jasper, Texas. While Lawrence Brewer emerged from prison consumed by hate, James Byrd Jr. came from a very different world. One defined by community, family, music, and faith. Born on May 2, 1949 in Jasper, Texas, James was the third of 8 children in a tightly knit black family. His father was a local pastor, and his mother worked as a homemaker, instilling in their children a deep sense of spirituality, pride and perseverance in the face of systemic racism that still lingered in East Texas. James grew up during the civil rights movement, attending segregated schools and witnessing firsthand the slow, painful journey toward racial equality. But through it all he remained hopeful. Friends and family remember him as kind, soft-spoken and charismatic, a man who loved to sing, crack jokes and never met a stranger. He had a wide smile, a love for R&B music, and a deep affection for his children, whom he adored. Though life wasn't always easy, he struggled with alcohol dependency and faced the same economic challenges that plagued many black men in small southern towns. James remained determined to live a full life and do right by those around him. He worked various odd jobs to support himself, often walking from place to place, and was known in Jasper as someone who always offered a helping hand, a ride, or a conversation. Despite his personal struggles, James never gave up on trying to better himself. In the years leading up to his death, he had begun to reconnect with family, focus on sobriety, and talk about future plans that included being a better father, staying out of trouble, and maybe one day getting out of Jasper to start fresh. As dawn broke over the pine forests of East Texas on June 8, 1998, what first responders discovered at the end of a remote, dusty logging trail just outside Jasper would haunt them for the rest of their lives. A trail of blood and body parts that told the unspeakable story of a night drenched in hatred, cruelty, and racial terror. James Byrd Jr.'s dismembered body, or what remained of it, was found grotesquely displayed near a small black church on Huff Creek Road. His torso badly mutilated, his head and right arm missing, his flesh stripped away by 3 miles of forced dragging behind a truck. The murder had begun just after midnight the night before, when Byrd, walking home after a family gathering, encountered Sean Berry, Lawrence Brewer, and John King riding in Berry's pickup truck. Byrd, trusting and familiar with at least one of them, accepted the offer of a ride, unaware that the 3 white men, 2 of them deeply involved in white supremacist prison gangs, were about to carry out one of the most heinous acts of racial violence since the days of Jim Crow. What started as a ride home quickly turned sinister as they veered onto a deserted logging path. Surrounded by the thick silence of the piney woods and the pitch-black obscurity of the rural night, Byrd was pulled from the vehicle and mercilessly beaten by all 3. They kicked him in the ribs, stomped on his head, and struck him with a wrench and a tire iron, his cries for help lost to the woods. The attack was relentless, driven by pure racial hatred. As Byrd lay battered and broken, Brewer and King retrieved a heavy logging chain from the truck bed and wrapped it tightly around Byrd's ankles, ignoring his pleas. Without remorse, they attached the other end to the hitch of the truck. What followed was a calculated act of racist torture. With Byrd still alive, they drove off, dragging him face down over the asphalt, gravel and hard-packed dirt of a winding back road for over 3 miles. The chain clanked as it tightened. His flesh was stripped from his body, bones scraped against the ground, and at one point his body hit a concrete drainage culvert that severed his head and arm. Byrd's life ended long before his body did. The perpetrators showed no remorse. After Byrd's death, they discarded what was left of his remains in front of a black church as if to make a grotesque, symbolic statement, a warning or perhaps a celebration of their racist ideology. They then drove to a local barbecue, cleaned up, and went about their mourning as if they had just returned from an errand rather than committed a modern-day lynching. Police were notified after a motorist discovered Byrd's remains at sunrise. When investigators arrived, they found a horrifying trail of evidence that led them to reconstruct the final moments of Byrd's life in graphic and devastating detail. Strewn along the dragging route were personal items, his wallet, keys, shredded clothing, and eventually his detached body parts. DNA testing would later confirm blood and tissue matched to Byrd along the entire stretch of road. Even more damning was the discovery of Miller Lite beer bottles bearing Brewer and King's fingerprints, a cigarette lighter engraved with a Ku Klux Klan logo belonging to King, and a wrench inscribed with "Berry left behind at the crime scene." When Berry was brought in for questioning, his story began to unravel, and the sickening truth was laid bare. The arrest of the trio was swift, but the horror of what they did would linger for generations. In interviews with police, first responders spoke of nightmares, trauma, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness in the face of such hate. One officer described the sight of Byrd's remains as worse than any battlefield, while another said, "I've seen car wrecks, I've seen shootings, but this was the devil's work." Forensic experts meticulously documented the evidence trail, detailing how Byrd's body had been ground down to bone in places. Autopsy results confirmed he was alive for most of the dragging, a revelation that deepened the collective grief and outrage. James Byrd Jr.'s murder wasn't just a hate crime, it was a savage ritual of white supremacy carried out in modern times, in a supposedly post-civil rights America. It exposed how deeply rooted racism still was, and still is, in parts of the country, and it ignited national outcry, prompting calls for hate crime legislation that would finally be realized over a decade later. The memory of Byrd's final horrific moments would not fade quickly, and neither would the demand for justice. In the aftermath of the horrific murder of James Byrd Jr., the small town of Jasper, Texas, found itself at the epicenter of a legal and moral reckoning. As investigators gathered overwhelming forensic and testimonial evidence, the prosecution built a case that not only exposed the unspeakable cruelty of the killing, but also laid bare the deeply rooted racism that had fueled it. The arrests of Lawrence Russell Brewer, John William King, and Sean Allen Berry were followed by months of intense legal preparation, with prosecutors determined to prove that the murder was not just an act of violence, but a calculated hate crime motivated by white supremacist ideology. From the beginning, the state of Texas pursued the death penalty against Brewer and King, citing not only their active roles in Byrd's dragging death, but the disturbing evidence of their neo-Nazi affiliations. Brewer's prison history was a central pillar of the prosecution's case. After serving time for drug possession and burglary, Brewer had joined the white supremacist Confederate Knights of America, while incarcerated, aligning himself with fellow white inmates under the umbrella of the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas. His body was a canvas of hatred. Tattoos displaying Aryan symbols, lightning bolts, and the words "white power" left no doubt as to his beliefs. He had reportedly told other inmates that once he got out, he wanted to make a statement. Tragically, that statement was the brutal killing of an innocent black man. In court, jurors heard chilling details about how Brewer and King had deliberately sought out a black victim that night. Prosecutors introduced letters and drawings confiscated from Brewer's prison cell that celebrated the killing. One letter read like a manifesto, glorifying the act as a wake-up call and a necessary purge. King, the other man sentenced to death, was shown to have an even more disturbing background, having authored white supremacist essays, displayed Nazi paraphernalia in his home, and even sent out racist newsletters from prison. During the trial, Sean Berry's defense argued that although Berry was present and drove the truck, he did not share the ideological hatred of his accomplices. Nevertheless, prosecutors insisted that he had ample opportunity to stop the crime, and chose not to. Unlike Brewer and King, Berry received a life sentence instead of death. The courtroom was packed daily with journalists, civil rights activists, and members of the public witnessing a rare moment in Texas justice. White men being held fully accountable for the racially motivated murder of a black man. The evidence was overwhelming. Jurors saw photographs of Brewer's tattoos, read excerpts from his racist writings, and watched emotional testimony from Byrd's children and siblings, who described the unbearable pain of knowing their loved one had been chained, dragged, and torn apart solely for the color of his skin. The verdicts came swiftly. Brewer and King were each found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death. The decision marked a pivotal moment in legal history. Texas, known for its fraught racial past, had just sentenced two white supremacists to die for the murder of a black man. This had never happened before in modern Texas history. National news outlets flooded Jasper. CNN, ABC, and major newspapers ran in-depth coverage of the trial and its implications. Civil rights leaders praised the decision as a sign that America was finally beginning to confront the violent legacy of white supremacy. Yet beyond the legal victory, the emotional toll on the Byrd family and the Jasper community remained immense. Outside the courthouse, protesters, journalists, and mourners gathered. Some held signs demanding racial unity, while others warned that the ideologies behind the murder were still deeply embedded in society. The courtroom sketches and footage captured the gravity of the moment. The stern faces of the jurors, the tear-streaked eyes of Byrd's children, and the defiant glares of Brewer and King, two men whose hatred had led them to commit one of the most horrifying crimes in recent memory. As the trials concluded, the story of James Byrd Jr. transcended Jasper. His name became synonymous with the modern civil rights movement. In the halls of Congress, lawmakers invoked his memory during debates on hate crime legislation. His death would eventually lead to the passage of the James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, signed into law in 2009, an enduring legacy that began with a long, painful trial, and a community's unwavering demand for justice. From the moment Lawrence Russell Brewer was sentenced to death, he began what would be a decade-long stay on Texas's death row at the Allen B. Polunsky Unit, a period marked not by reflection or repentance but by a chilling and defiant embrace of the very ideologies that had brought him there. As he openly declared in a prison interview, "I have no regrets. I'd do it all over again," a statement that sent shockwaves through a nation still grappling with the horror of James Byrd Jr.'s murder and cemented Brewer's image as unrepentant and remorseless. During these years behind bars, he remained closely tied to white supremacist gangs, never renouncing the violent racism that defined both his past crimes and his affiliations. And as the years passed, Brewer became a symbol of hate that many activists, civil rights leaders and public figures, including the NAACP and even former Texas Governor and Richards's allies, used to highlight the enduring threat of racially motivated violence in America, fueling calls for stronger hate crime laws and justice reform. Still, appeals and petitions rolled in, and while some argued against capital punishment in principle, few defended Brewer's actions. His case instead became a litmus test for the limits of mercy in the face of unrepentant evil. And so, after years of legal wrangling, clemency requests, and mounting public attention, the execution date was officially scheduled for September 21, 2011, marking the final chapter in Brewer's life as the state of Texas prepared to carry out the ultimate sentence. A moment captured by haunting footage of Huntsville's red brick death row facility, dim courtroom scenes from appeals hearings, and grim-faced statements by law enforcement officials who had witnessed the case unfold from the crime scene to the gurney. In what would become one of the most infamous moments in the history of capital punishment in Texas, Lawrence Russell Brewer made a last meal request so excessive and extravagant that it drew widespread attention from media, politicians, and the general public alike. In the hours leading up to his scheduled execution on September 21, 2011, Brewer submitted a request that read more like a buffet menu than a final indulgence. He asked for 2 chicken fried steaks drenched in country gravy and topped with sliced onions, a triple meat bacon cheeseburger with all the traditional fixings on the side, and a hearty cheese omelet loaded with ground beef, tomatoes, onions, bell peppers and jalapenos. His order continued with a large bowl of fried okra accompanied by ketchup, 1 full pound of smoky barbecue served with half a loaf of white bread, 3 beef fajitas with the full range of condiments, and a meat lover's pizza stacked with multiple types of meat. For dessert, he asked for a pint of Bluebell vanilla ice cream and a thick slab of peanut butter fudge sprinkled with crushed peanuts. To wash it all down, he ordered not 1 but 3 root beers. But what happened next turned this lavish request into a lightning rod for outrage. Despite the kitchen staff's efforts to prepare the massive feast exactly as specified, Brewer refused to take a single bite. He reportedly stared at the tray but left everything untouched, prompting immediate criticism and anger across the state. For many, especially the family of James Byrd Jr. and the Texas taxpayers who footed the bill, it wasn't just a wasted meal, it was a final insult, a calculated act of defiance or mockery that fit perfectly with Brewer's unapologetic attitude throughout his imprisonment. The gesture was seen by some as one last slap in the face to a system he had already manipulated for over a decade. The backlash was swift and severe. Texas State Senator John Whitmire, who chaired the Senate Criminal Justice Committee, fired off a letter to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice demanding an end to the long-standing tradition of granting death row inmates a final meal of their choosing. "It is extremely inappropriate to give a person sentenced to death such a privilege," he wrote. "Enough is enough." That very day the policy was rescinded. Going forward, death row inmates in Texas would receive the same meal as every other prisoner. No exceptions, no requests. Brewer's actions, which many interpreted as a final cruel joke, ultimately resulted in the abolition of a 90-year tradition, marking a dramatic and controversial shift in the way executions were handled in the state. As the sun dipped low over the aging red brick walls of the Huntsville unit in Texas, a somber air settled on September 21, 2011. At precisely 6:21 p.m., Lawrence Russell Brewer was strapped to a gurney inside the death chamber, surrounded by the sterile glow of fluorescent lights and the hushed presence of witnesses. His hands were secured, IV lines inserted into his arms, and he lay motionless under a crisp white sheet as the chemicals began to flow. When asked if he had any final words, Brewer coldly replied, "No. I have no final statement." There was no apology, no regret, no acknowledgement of the pain his actions had inflicted. Just silence. Witnesses noted that a single tear slid down Brewer's cheek, an ambiguous and haunting image. Was it emotion, defiance, or simply a physical reaction? No one could say for certain. Outside the prison, reporters and protesters gathered, some calling for justice, others questioning the death penalty itself. Inside, members of James Byrd Jr.'s family, including his sisters and children, watched intently. For them, this was not vengeance, it was closure. Brewer had shown no remorse in the years since the brutal dragging death of their loved one, and now, justice as prescribed by law had been carried out. 10 minutes after the lethal drugs were administered, Brewer was officially pronounced dead, his execution witnessed by media, legal representatives, and the victim's family. His death marked a grim but final chapter in a case that had shocked the nation and forced it to confront the modern reality of racial hatred. James Byrd Jr.'s brutal murder became more than just a tragic crime. It became a catalyst for real, lasting change. In 2001, Texas enacted its own hate crimes law, and in 2009, the federal Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act was signed into law, expanding protections against hate-motivated violence across the United States. In Jasper, the town where it all happened, the community has worked toward healing. Memorials stand not just as reminders of the horror, but as commitments to unity and remembrance. Lawrence Brewer's legacy is one of hatred, defiance, and unintended consequence, his last act sparking change in prison policy. But in the broader picture, it's James Byrd Jr.'s name that endures, forever tied to America's ongoing battle against racism and bigotry. One man died a brutal death. Another died by lethal injection. But the impact of James Byrd Jr.'s murder echoes louder than the chains that ended his life, and it continues to shape America's fight against hate. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you believe justice was served? How should society handle crimes of hate moving forward? Share your views in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video. Share it with others who need to hear this story. And subscribe for more powerful true crime documentaries that matter.